Marry me, Annie here. And the subject for this week's YouTube Pagan Challenge is, do we celebrate, and what do we celebrate for the Wheel of the Year? Oh yes, I celebrate the Wheel of the Year. And I have since my very first experience with circles in the early 70s. Things have changed a bit over time as far as what I celebrate and when. In my first circle, we only celebrate the cross-quarter dates, so the first decade of pagan spirituality for me was all about winter and midwinter and summer and midsummer, so Samhain and Imbolc, Beltane, and Lammas. The year was set into quarters, two halves to each of the dark and the light halves of the year. It was in the 80s when I had moved away from my earliest circle and was meeting other people who were doing things differently, and books started being published about various ways to celebrate the Wheel of the Year. And then I first really encountered the concept of the 8 spokes on the wheel. I wasn't so sure about that at first. It seemed to me that celebrating the lunar tide, the full and the dark moons, and the cross-quarter dates sufficed. I thought it met all my spiritual needs. And then some things happened when, on my own as a solitary practitioner, and then when I met the next coven that I would be part of for a decade again, I learned more about myself, pausing more often, pausing at the 8 turnings instead of the 4. I was aware that there were more subtle shifts in the year, and it caused me to look at things a little more differently. Although the 4 always seemed like major milestones where huge changes were made. And I became to understand by celebrating the 8 instead of the 4 that there were no huge changes, that the entire Wheel of the Year is a subtle flow. And also, celebrating the 8 brought me much more aligned to the solar aspect of my practice, and specifically the god. I guess the shadings and the turning of the year are so much more obvious under the sun and during our days than they are at night. It made a big difference for me. I was involved with a spiritual group for quite some time. We celebrated the 8, but we were then encouraged by one of the elders in our group to give that up and instead to determine what our sacred pauses during the turning of the year would be. It gave me the opportunity to see, did the traditional alignments and correspondences of these sabbats match the land I lived on? Or was I forcing them? Did I truly relate to them deeply? Well, I found out that for me, they did. Where I live happens to be that well balanced that I connected fully with the alignment of the 8. So wandering away and exploring whether I would put other date and time stamps on the year were not important in the sense that they didn't change the way I celebrated and when, but they made me realize that much more deeply why I celebrated what I did and when I did it. At the same time, as an aside, we were encouraged to give up the traditional names of the moons and come up with our own. Now that change I did benefit greatly from. So whether I honored 4 or 8, or in the time I experimented with naming my own points of turning, well, that may have changed. Now what didn't change is what I was looking for in those pauses. I was looking for an understanding of the shifting in the land that I lived on, the natural world around me, the balancing of energies, and the presence, more or less, of any one or any combination of elements. I was looking to tie that into my story about the gods as I know them. And I was looking for an exploration of psyche, of understanding myself and myself in relation to. What could any period of celebration, because the Sabbats to me are from the eve that they begin until the next Sabbat begins. So that gives me quite a time to explore who I am in relation to remind myself of the stories of the gods as I have come to know them, and to honor the land that I live on. I guess the only other thing I could add is I do honor the 8 turnings without fail. Now, if there's a time that for some reason I need to do something very simply and not my usual ritual celebration, that can change. But like with celebrating the full and the dark moons, I will without fail take the time for the sacred pause. The sacred pauses, as I have deemed them to be meaningful to me in the turning of the year. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Merry part.